If I make up a resume for an engineer, just totally make it up, put anything on it that I want to, and I take that resume and I put a man's name at the top, like David. Then I take that same resume and I put a woman's name at the top, say Maria. And I take those identical resumes for David and Maria and I submit those to the hiring committee. Then research shows that the committee will evaluate David as more qualified than Maria every time. Every time.
Remember the STEM gender bias that made its way through the headlines and TED Talks 10, 15 years ago? Why don't we ever hear so much about that these days? Nearly every headline, lecture, and outcry that came at the time was because of one study. So it's a study that you probably have heard about, even if you've never read it. In 2012, researchers gave science professors an application from a student who wanted to be a lab manager. Half of the hiring professors saw an application from someone named John, the other half from someone named Jennifer. Everything else was the same qualifications and experience, same application. The only thing that changed was the gendered name. And the result made major headlines for years because faculty treated John as more competent and more hireable. They were more willing to mentor him, they offered him a higher starting salary, and the message was simple but powerful that discrimination was live and well against women. And this study didn't just appear into obscurity like most research does. As you can see here, Yale promoted the findings under the headline, "Scientists Not Immune from Gender Bias." Wired covered the study as evidence that scientists were treating identically qualified women worse than men. In Time magazine, they later referred to it as a famous study illustrating the difficulty that women face getting hired in STEM. Years later, Wired was still explaining the study as part of what it called a broad body of evidence showing that women in science were evaluated less favorably than men. The public discussion was so significant that another research team later analyzed 831 reader comments that were posted beneath 3 prominent press articles about that study. I'll put some of those main findings on the screen here if you want to pause and have a look. So, in other words, researchers eventually studied the public reaction to the media coverage of that 2012 report. Academically, the paper became one of the most widely known studies of gender bias ever published. It accumulated thousands of citations in other research papers, and it continued appearing in reviews, university resources, discussions about even unconscious bias, and other arguments about gender discrimination in STEM fields. But what happens when somebody does it again, years later, on a grander scale? By going back to the same John versus Jennifer test and recruiting a much larger group of professors and seeing whether that original result would happen again. Well, we have an answer for that. And what they found creates a very different picture of gender bias in STEM today. If you want the full article of this video, the study links, and a few additional side-by-side visuals that compare the original study with this replication, I've put all of that on Substack in an article linked below. All right, so first we need to fully understand the context of the 2012 study. Corinne Moss-Racusin and her colleagues, they recruited 127 biology, chemistry, and physics professors from research-intensive universities. Each professor evaluated what happened to be an undergraduate that was applying for a lab manager position. The application was intentionally good enough to be plausible, but not so spectacular that there was room for debate. That level of the application quality was important to the process because bias is easier to detect when evaluators have some type of discretion in their hiring process. Now, 63 professors received the application from John. 64 received the same application from Jennifer. And the professors were then rated the applicant's competence, their hireability, how much mentoring they would provide the applicant, and what salary they would offer. As you can imagine, and as was reported, John's average competence rating was higher, about 4.0 on a 7-point scale, with Jennifer's being 3.3. Hireability was about 3.8 for John and 2.9 for Jennifer. And faculty also reported being more willing to mentor John. Now remember, we're talking about the original 2012 study here. And then there was the salary. The average proposed starting salary for John was $30,200-ish. And for Jennifer, it was 26,500-ish. Now that's a difference of roughly $3,700 a year for two applicants whose resumes were and their qualifications were identical. Male and female professors also showed the same overall pattern favoring John over Jennifer. They therefore argued, these authors, that this was not simply men favoring other men. Their interpretation was that it's evidence of a broader cultural bias from both men and women. And there was actually one interesting exception. Professors in the study, they actually liked Jennifer more than they liked John. But that greater likability didn't lead to better hiring outcomes. Now, that combination helps explain why the study became such a durable piece of the public discussion about women in STEM. Jennifer was more likable, but John was favored for the position. Now let's move forward 13 years to 2025. Now, the replication study that I'm about to describe was pre-registered in 2020. It received in-principle acceptance before data collection in 2021, and the completed results were released in late 2024. Then it was accepted and published in 2025. So if you go looking and you see a 2020 publication date, that's because that comes from the pre-registration part. Think of that, for those of you who are academics, like a proposal for a thesis or a dissertation. So that's what that 2020 date means. It was published in 2025. Now, relative to the 2012 publication, these authors tried to fully replicate that original study. They used the same application materials with minor updates, such as changing dates and converting GRE scores to the newer scoring system. Participants, again, saw only one applicant, John or Jennifer. And the applications were otherwise identical. The authors ran 3 close replications and then pooled the results from those 3 in a combined analysis. Study 1 focused on science faculty, just like the original study. Study 2 extended the sample to include technology, engineering, and mathematics. Study 3 again used those fields, but changed whether participants were paid, and that allowed the researchers to determine whether compensation might affect results. So, altogether, the pooled dataset contained 1,293 tenured or tenured track STEM faculty, which were members from 113 R1 universities. That's high Research 1 universities, 79 of which were public, 34 of which were private institutions. There were 622 evaluations of John and 671 evaluations of Jennifer. So the new data set was roughly 10 times the size of the original, and it covered a much broader slice of STEM. This newer replication study also had extremely high statistical power to detect any effects as large as the one that was reported in 2012. So if the original anti-female effect was still there at anything close to its original size, then this design should have little trouble finding it.
And I submit those to the hiring committee. Then research shows that the committee will evaluate David as more qualified than Maria every time. Every time. Every time.
And now let's get to those results. Oddly enough, the new study didn't replicate findings from that 2012 study. But that statement seriously understates what happened. The results didn't just simply move toward parity or equality. They absolutely, totally reversed directions entirely. Across the combined sample, professors rated Jennifer as more competent than John. 5.14, this is on a 7-point scale, 5.14 versus 4.18. They rated Jennifer as more hireable at 4.84 versus 4.39, and they offered Jennifer more mentoring, 5.23 versus 4.97. And get this, they also offered Jennifer a higher salary, about $30,500 compared to John, who they offered $34,100-ish. The largest of these 4 core effects was hireability. The meta-analytic effect size was about 0.34, for those of you who are stats nerds out there, in favor of Jennifer over John. Now, that's not an enormous effect size, and the authors are clear that the modern pro-female preferences were smaller than the pro-male differences reported in their original 2012 study. I know that's a lot to comprehend. But it's also not just random. In the pooled analysis, the female advantage was statistically significant for all 4: competence, hireability, mentoring, and salary. And then there's a fascinating detail. Remember the one finding from 2012 that favored Jennifer? That was her likability. People liked her more than they liked John. But that finding did replicate. In the replication study, Jennifer again was more likable than John. In fact, it was the strongest gender difference in the new pooled data. Jennifer's average likability rating was 5.19 compared to John's at 4.50. So when we put the old and the new studies side by side, here's the pattern. In 2012, Jennifer was liked more, but John was judged to be more competent, more hireable, more deserving of being mentored, and worthy of a higher salary. In the replication, Jennifer swept all of them. So how's that for a clean reversal? And the evaluating professor's own sex had no effect in this replication study. In that study, there was no significant interaction between faculty gender and applicant gender on any of the 5 measures. So in plain English, the pro-female pattern was not influenced only by female professors. Male and female professors showed broadly similar applicant gender effects. And that mirrors another important feature of that 2012 paper. Back then, male and female professors had also shown broadly similar applicant gender effects, except the advantage favored John. So this is not a simple matter of male professors favoring men in 2012 and female evaluators favoring women later. The direction of the favorability itself changed for both professor sexes. So the obvious question is, why? I'll give some context, but also leave your thoughts in a comment. To be completely objective, this is where we have to separate what the experiment in the study, what it can and cannot demonstrate. Those authors, they offer several possibilities, but they do explicitly describe them as pure speculation. One possibility is that social attitudes changed. I think this is probably a pretty important one. The original data came from a different era, and more than a decade of intense attention to gender bias may have changed how academics evaluate women and men. A second possibility is that attempts to correct anti-female bias may now sometimes overcorrect. That pendulum has fully swung and overcorrected. If evaluators have repeatedly been told to watch out for bias against women, they may consciously or unconsciously give a female applicant an advantage when 2 candidates appear equally qualified. And a third possibility is maybe less dramatic. The original study may simply have overestimated the true effect. That 2012 report had only 127 participants. And as many of you know, small studies can produce inflated effect sizes and occasionally produce false positives. The replication, on the other hand, had more than 1,000 faculty members and much more greater statistical power. And those explanations are not mutually exclusive. That is, the original finding could have been real in 2012 and attitudes could have shifted. The original effect could also have been larger than the true effect because of sampling variation, or both of these things could be true at the same time. The replication cannot tell us, obviously, which explanation is correct, so there is need for some speculation as to why the results did a total 180. And here's more evidence. A separate study published in Research Policy in 2025 examined evaluations of hypothetical assistant professor candidates by almost 1,900 professors at German universities. It covered mathematics and physics, social sciences, and some German studies. Once again, female applicants received somewhat higher ratings than male applicants for both perceived qualification and for the likelihood that they should be invited to interview. Those authors described the female advantage as small, and the German study is not directly comparable, I get it, to the American lab manager study. Different job, different country, different design. I get it. But this does make the broader question harder to dismiss. Are some institutions still operating within an old mental model of gender bias, even as the direction of bias in certain selection situations has changed? And that brings us to what I think is the major takeaway here. The 2012 study created a media storm. Its finding that science faculty favored an identical male applicant became widely reputed as an example of discrimination against women in STEM. It was covered in the media, cited thousands of times, and shaped much of a large public conversation around barriers that women face in science. And for years, findings like this helped shape what gender bias in STEM was considered to look like. But when researchers come back with much larger samples, pre-registered methods, and results showing anti-male bias in STEM, the reaction was nothing like in 2012.
Every time. Every time. Every time.
Would any of you have known this if I hadn't just exposed it? Anyone here see this headline anywhere in the last couple of years, demanding answers and justice? There's no media storm around it this time. There's no widespread discussion about what the reversal means. And that raises an uncomfortable question again. If these new studies had once again found discrimination against women, would you have already heard about them? My guess is that we'd already be having a second storm of media waves if the results had been replicated. But that's because it's you that's being discriminated against this time. We get nothing. So that may be the most interesting part of all of this research. The original experiment became a public outcry of victimhood when that newspapers, magazines, universities, researchers, and advocates all around the globe, not just here in the United States, something that they could point to because the result was unfavorable toward women, while this newer research is just collecting dust. Cheers, everybody. Let me know your thoughts. Enjoy your weekend, and be careful out there.